Marsha Berzon of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California. I have been sort of serendipitously on the board of CLIP for a while, the advisory board. And I, as a matter of full disclosure, know probably less about any of these matters than anybody else in the room, which makes it interesting because I ask sometimes naive but thoughtful questions, I hope, which I hope are useful. We are going to start with a kickstart from Ed Stroz, who is the founder and co-president of Stroz Friedberg, a global digital risk management and investigations firm. Before starting the firm, he was special agent with the FBI, where he formed their computer crime squad in New York. He is a CPA and has extensive experience in investigations of white-collar crime, including bank fraud and securities fraud, and he's testified in court numerous times as an expert witness. He has prepared some interesting material, and from it we will have, hopefully, an invigorating conversation. Ed? I'll introduce the rest of the panel later.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope you don't mind I use the podium. It gives me a chance to stand up. Joel, thank you very much, and everybody for coming. It's an honor to address the group and to see everybody from CLIP. I think the dialogue that extends from this is not only interesting but very important and kind of formative because there's not enough of it going on. This particular section, which we have entitled Security and Trust, I think gets to one of the most fundamental parts of the actual investigative actions and security objectives and the way they are implemented in our economy and in customer service. I was in the FBI for 16 years, and then 15 years ago started a firm that specialized in understanding digital evidence and how it helps to establish facts, and facts lead you to the truth of a matter. I tried to synthesize down what I think is a way to sort of introduce what this panel will be addressing, and just maybe some points that I have noticed over the years and have come to see that I think are rather foundational. First of all, security has generally been seen as, you know, sort of like a nice thing to have, and if you live in a nice, comfortable neighborhood, you know, you think about it less. If you live in a more challenged neighborhood, you think about it more. Very often for businesses, security was seen as a cost center, sort of a compliance thing, something you had to have, usually not a lot of business value. I would say in my experience in the last year or so, that's changed. Security actually, and in information security, can be an example of a good brand. It could be an example of the kind of thing that makes a consumer confident and willing to engage with you in a way I didn't see before. I cannot think of a time when security had direct relationship to good brand identity. And it's not true in every single company, but it is truer now than ever before. And as a consequence, we're actually being called to speak directly to the board of directors. The topic of security is on their agenda. It's either an audit committee or the full board, and they're asking better questions. As opposed to just saying, well, yes, management will make sure things are secure, now they're saying, how do I know we're secure, and in what kind of way? And when it comes to information, it's especially tricky. It almost always, when you talk about security today, and I'm going to steer more towards information security, cybersecurity, the kinds of things that are mostly at the heart of what we're talking about here, I find that the dialogue almost always leads early on to say, well, what is the role of the government in achieving security? What can a company expect from the government? Can they protect us, and can they help us? And that is a topic in and of itself, but very often the next thing that comes up from that is, well, how much can we trust the government if they're supposed to play any role in this? Can we trust them to protect us? If we wind up working with the government, can we trust them with our information? If we don't trust the government and we don't want to work with them, how do we deal with them when they tap us on the shoulder and tell us that our network has been penetrated? And now they do sort of have a seat at the table. So this becomes, I think, a very important consideration about trust as it relates to government. I think it's kind of instructive. I've heard sort of like two polar extremes over the last year about how to see government. One is actually an example that has been cited by the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District, Preet Bharara. We were talking about it a few minutes ago. And he quotes from a prominent individual in the field. I won't use his name because I don't think it's important, but Preet uses his name. And the quote is something to the effect of, look, I'm sick of hearing the government say that the private sector has to step up and implement stronger security. Says it's really the government's job to protect us, and they're not really doing the job that they should. It's roughly that kind of quote. And then Preet basically stops and says, I don't know who this person is, but he has no idea how it works. The government can't give this kind of security and can't be expected to fulfill that role. And I'm not trying to step into that debate, but just saying, all right, so there's one sort of very thoughtful individual making a statement and a very thoughtful, responsible public servant answering to it. And then on the other side, you have other companies saying, no, we know what the government does, and we're fearful that they do even more than we want them to. So we're going to implement protections and encryption that the government is not going to be able to break. And my point in raising this is not to take a position on either of those, but say this is the polarity that people are hearing, and it affects the discussion that we have when we meet with boards of directors about even what they can expect. Now, sometimes it plays out in a way, I can tell you from doing work over the last 15 years, especially in the last several, that the government often is the source of the information that a company learns to find out that they've been penetrated. And usually when the government comes and tells them of the penetration, they don't give them very much information, just a couple of IP addresses, because they can't share too much. Usually the adversary has been inside the network for months. And sometimes the government will say, here's what you're up against. You have to check your network for certain things. And by the way, we, the government, would like to put some technology into your network to monitor some of the activities so that we can be more effective in understanding this adversary and what they're doing on your network. Again, just think about it. Do you trust the government to enough to even consider that? Some companies do, some companies do not. But I think the point here is that it's very important to understand how trust actually plays in the area of security. I think I was also listening to Mike Morrell, former CIA, talk about just how important it is for people to have trust in government, and that the way you build trust, especially today, where so many things in the newspaper have shaken us up. I mean, look at the disclosures from Snowden. Whatever your opinion about Edward Snowden, those were monumental things to address. I mean, that really concerned people about, my God, what is the security level here? And the way you reestablish trust very often is to show people what you are doing. If you don't trust me or my firm, one of the ways, maybe the only way, that I can try to reestablish your trust is to demonstrate what I'm doing. Unfortunately, that card is not really available to the NSA and the FBI. They cannot fully reveal what they're doing because of national security concerns. And so even if we seek to reestablish trust, it's going to be very difficult to do so when the party who might be able to win your trust by disclosing things to you is just not able to do so. It's a tough question. It is a very tough question. I think I've heard one model come up. It was spoken actually in this room by Dick Clark, who mentioned that he felt that there was a breakdown in trust, and that maybe one of the ways to establish better trust between government and industry in the area of security would be for the government to have a clearer value proposition and basically give companies a choice to say, look, if you would like the government to bring more of its technical horsepower to help you with security, then you can elect to be part of a government relationship where the information that we, the government, would need to work with can be shared with us, and you therefore can get that kind of protection. I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but I think it's thought-provoking. And some of the materials that I think are worth us considering as we listen to the panel today. So I would just close by saying I think we need a public dialogue on what security really means, how trust affects it. I think that naturally leads to the role of government. And I think exploring this topic today in the context of this conference is quite valuable and important. And with that, Marsha, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel, and then I will open by posing a question, and I hope that it will go from there without me, but we will see. The other members of the panel, all of whom have incredibly relevant and fascinating backgrounds, begin with Steve Bellovin, who is the Piercy K. and Vidal L.W. Hudson Professor of Computer Science at Columbia University, where he does research on network security and especially why the two don't get along, as well as related public policy issues. I learned last night that he teaches an undergraduate class in computers and society. He was at one point the chief technologist of the Federal Trade Commission, and he is on numerous boards, including the National Research Council study committees that work on information system trustworthiness and cybersecurity research needs. Okay. Next, we have Thomas Kim, who is both the Chief Compliance Officer for Thomson Reuters as well as the General Counsel of its Global Growth and Operations business. He leads enterprise-wide compliance efforts across all the Thomson Reuters businesses around the world with regard to anti-bribery, privacy, business ethics, and trade controls. He also oversees a diverse global legal department that supports all of the Thomson Reuters businesses in emerging markets. And again, listening to him last night, he seems to fly around the world a lot, and particularly for the purposes of this panel, which is partly about the reaction of foreign governments and companies to surveillance by the United States and other governments. He's particularly knowledgeable. David O'Neill, whom I have not met, is a litigation partner and member of the Debevoise and Plimpton's White Collar and Regulatory Group. Before joining Debevoise, he served for 8 years in prominent positions within the Department of Justice. He was designated in early 2004 to lead the criminal division, and before that, he was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the fraud section. Sorry? No, okay. And finally, Ira Rubinstein is a senior fellow at the Information Law Institute at the NYU School of Law. He teaches courses in privacy law. His research interests include internet privacy and security, surveillance, and big data. He previously spent 19 years in Microsoft's law department, most recently as Associate General Counsel, running the Regulatory Affairs and Public Policy Group. So, to begin, I thought I would ask, because it was a question that Ed's presentation raised for me, is security from what? When you're talking about security, are you talking about consumer security from ID fraud? Are you talking about security from government surveillance? Are you talking about security from other corporate hacking, essentially? Are you talking about security from public exposure? What security are you talking about that companies either need or don't need government assistance for and are afraid of with regard to government involvement? So, can some of you address this? Steve, do you want to start?
I think actually security from what is really one of the key questions. The first two questions I teach my students in security class to ask is, what are you trying to protect and against whom? You need different measures to protect against a government than against the teenager down the street. You need different things if you're trying to protect against an insider. You need to protect valuable assets more strongly. Some things a government won't help you with, some they will. If you're dealing with another nation state as your enemy, you probably need a nation state on your side as well. But then you've got to ask, do you trust that particular nation state not to betray your secrets? It's a multi-party world with lots of governments all spying on each other and on each other's companies. And there's often no optimum spot in there.
I agree that it is one of the critical questions, and I think the answer really depends on what kind of enterprise you are. If you are a company that has a lot of customer data, then I think it's security from people who are going to try to take that data and go make money off it at the expense of your customers. It can run the entire range on the other side too. If you're a technology company that depends on your customers' trust in your products, it's security from government and security from the perception that the government is in your networks and monitoring the traffic. I think it's one of the most important things that any company, any institution that is facing this can ask at the outset, because everything flows from the answer to those two questions.
I think that's an excellent question, and the answer, when you were saying it, in my mind, is yes. And I think it's why it's so complicated, and I agree with you that over the last year and a half, I think it's been reaching critical mass in terms of the board level of large corporations, and I think it's because we're realizing all the different permutations and ways it can manifest itself. And it is very much, as Steve said, a multi-party environment that we're playing in, and it is basically playing several games of chess at the same time. And it is something that I think particularly hard to understand if you are an international corporation. If you're a domestic corporation operating within one country, I think there's certain parameters around which you can look at the problems that you're facing. But if you are an international corporation operating across the world, I think you have even more of those challenges that you're trying to face. And I think you're trying to figure out how do you balance some of the protections you might want to deal with one challenge, which actually might not mitigate a particular risk from another challenge.
I think especially pertinent area for addressing this question is security in the cloud. And the Snowden revelations put that in very sharp focus. And I think you're quite right that this has to be looked at internationally. And when we speak of governments, we mean not only the US government, but other governments as well. And the Snowden so in general, I think cloud security means at the very least that individuals and enterprises who trust their data to the cloud expect at least the same level of security as when they either stored data locally on their own machines or ran their own IT services as an enterprise. So they don't want less security than that. And the Snowden revelations made it plain that the NSA was intercepting data as it flowed between cloud centers. And this caused, I think, two things that we need to focus on in this session. One is a good deal of outrage among US companies on the one hand, and a good deal of upset overseas where companies felt that they couldn't trust US vendors. And both of those issues are very significant in terms of understanding trust and security.
Now, my understanding, and this is again with the caveat that I know less about any of this than anybody in the room, is that the cloud issue is that the data centers, it's not that information is running around in the cloud, it's that it's on data centers, but not here, or many of them are not here, and they're not your own data centers. And so that leads to the question, as I understand it, of as for American companies, is how the apparent insecurity of those data centers has led, what reactions that has led to, or what the possible reactions are as a result. And I gather from something I read that there is an importance in having the data center somewhere nearer to the users, and yet if there's some countries now are saying that they're not happy about having American companies
There,
their data in their country.
yeah, from a technical perspective, yes, you're right. You want the data center near the user because of an issue of latency, how long it takes the signal to travel through the fiber optic cables from the user to the data center. You're limited by the speed of light, and even Google has not been able to beat that. And if you're going to set up an encrypted session, there are a lot of extra round trips, and this can cause a noticeable lag in performance. You want to put the data centers near the users. On the other hand, you don't want to put the data centers in a country where the government might either physically infiltrate or show up with appropriate legal process. You know, Google has pulled out of some countries because they don't want governments showing up with legal process. China, for example, I believe reports on Russia as well, and saying, give us the data. It means that they might have to locate data centers in ways that are suboptimal technically in order to protect the data of their users. And whether or not they themselves actually care, it's a marketing issue, it's a perception issue. Customers don't want their data exposed, and they will stay away from a vendor who's more exposed. So, you know, some governments react differently. If you're in China, it's hard to get to Google because China wants to go see what's going on. And there's a lot of different trade-offs there.
And I would say the other wrinkle, following up on your question, Judge Berzon, that I've found fascinating is since Snowden, for the first time as a US-trained lawyer, I am receiving a lot of comments from people abroad saying we're uncomfortable with our data being in the US. And so, you know, some of my Latin American colleagues here will be able to be aware of, for example, I think Brazil is really leading some of the sort of more assertive legislation, in proposed legislation with regards to that. And it's not a situation that many American companies are used to, having to explain to people how data is secure in our country. And so it's not just, I think, a problem that's present in foreign countries for Americans to consider, but it's one that people are asking the same questions about this country.
I mean, this is in some ways exactly the issue that is being litigated right now in the Second Circuit in the case that Microsoft is in the middle of, where the issue is whether the US can get access to data stored abroad through a search warrant served here. Companies have gone about this problem in a whole range of ways. Some have decided to keep their data in the United States so that it remains subject to US data protection laws and US restrictions on sharing information with other countries. Others have chosen to locate data around the world to keep it away from the United States government. And so, you know, I don't think that anyone has come up with the right solution to it, but I think you can't underestimate, as Ira was saying, the importance of customer perceptions in all of this, because in a lot of ways, what we're talking about is marketing that was caused by the Snowden disclosures and perceptions and misperceptions about what the United States was doing. And these companies are responding to a customer demand for privacy and for perceptions that when they store their data, whether on their devices or in the cloud, that it's safe and is not going to be subject to government surveillance.
I gather that the customers in these examples, or the people who are upset, are at least to some degree foreign governments. They're not foreign companies necessarily. So how does that play out with regard to, maybe I gather it's because, you know, Brazil was using, the government was using Google and Yahoo and so on. And
Well, I mean, to tie it back to the actual political facts, and politics drives a lot of this, I think, and I don't think there was anyone from Brazil that I met last night, but I think what happened was there were reports that the Brazilian government officials were spied on by the U.S. And so then this was sort of a retaliatory.
through these backdoor,
Yeah.
I assume through these cable connections of
You know, and if you look at some of the other legislation that's been recently proposed, if you look at the Russian data localization legislation, that in part is driven by a reaction to what they perceive as to be Western legislation that's targeting them. What's harder to explain, I think, is some countries like South Korea that have a very restrictive regime that isn't driven, I think, so much by politics. But it is the reality of the geopolitical landscape on this issue. I think China's another good example with the recent proposal that they had in the financial services space that would require American companies and any Western company, frankly, that provides technology in the financial services sector to give the government there access to technology. So there's been a lot of debate both here and in Europe and in China about what that means and can companies even technically comply with that if they wanted to. So there's a lot of different things that drive this behavior, and there's a lot of different motivations, I think.
Just to add a few observations, it's also important to note that the leading cloud services are primarily, if not exclusively, U.S. services. And that complicates the issue. And if you think about the best case scenario, to go back to your question about where to locate data centers, the best case scenario for U.S. firms, taking account of Steve's point about latency, is create a sufficient number of data centers close to large customer bases, but not too redundant, so you don't want a data center in each and every country. And then as far as where the data is actually located for a given customer or enterprise, it should be located wherever it's convenient for running the service. It should make no difference to the customer or to the service itself whether the data is in a data center in the Netherlands, a data center in the UK. It should just go where it needs to go and be retrieved when it needs to be retrieved. What the Snowden revelations did, however, was to put considerable pressure on that with not only Brazil, but other European countries, and even to some extent the European Parliament, either introducing or discussing laws that would have a localization requirement, that the data center has to be in country. That's partly to serve government customers, but it's also a response to Snowden, so it would be for all commercial customers. And now you're quickly moving towards the worst case scenario, which is that, number one, to do business overseas, US companies would have to locate data centers in every country, which doesn't scale very well, is costly, exposes data to a number of non-democratic regimes, so that's fairly ugly. And to some extent, this is also just driven by protectionism, particularly in Europe, where the Snowden revelations driving these localization requirements are really a way to boost local services and put burdens on US firms in order to prop up local cloud services.
Yeah, I think that is a critical point. I do think there's a fair amount of opportunism here. There is outrage, certainly, but there is also a recognition that this is the perception that the U.S. government is targeting U.S. technology manufacturers uniquely is an opportunity for other countries to promote their indigenous technology markets. And I think it's especially interesting now where Europe is both still expressing outrage, but also increasingly anxious about the threat of foreign fighters that have gone to Syria and are returning. And so they are, on the one hand, saying, how dare you collect this data? And by the way, can we see it?
Steve, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that to some extent, this business of government surveillance of other communications is not particularly new. Sometime, starting the latter part of the 19th century through about World War II, Britain had a very aggressive policy of monitoring the world's telegraph networks. They were to the international telegraph network what the U.S. is to the internet. They had the technology. They were also the physical hub. Most undersea cables touched Britain itself or part of the British Empire, and they were not unaware of this. This was a deliberate policy on their part, monitoring other countries' communications, and they sent their own telegrams by the so-called all-red route. Red was the color of the British Empire on their maps, to avoid other countries doing the same to them. They would lay cables that had no other use than to preserve the all-red route.
It's interesting to me that in this conversation we've been using the word companies, but I assume that we're largely talking about the large internet companies with data centers, not the individual users, even like Thomson Reuters, is that right?
I mean, there's it's an interesting thing when historic trends sort of intersect and are in conflict. And one of the things that's been happening over the last 5 years has been many business units, whether they're large corporations like Thomson Reuters or even small companies that have apps, have realized they shouldn't be in the business of running cable, and they shouldn't be in the business of delivering connectivity to their end customers. And so there's been a large move to have people provide that service. Then there's also been a large move over the last 5 years to get more effective and more efficient about doing that. And that's led to a disbursement of data across a lot of geographies and sort of
And some centralization too, I assume.
well, it's both, but I mean, if you're really looking at things it's not always logical in terms of the shortest distance. You're looking at going to the point, you're looking at latency. So sometimes that requires different moves. So then you have that, and then you have these geopolitical events that are also happening, and sometimes that can be in conflict. So going to the cloud provider situation. So a few years ago, you would think if you were in charge of trying to reduce the technology spend for a large corporation, that maybe your proposal would be, we would stop using our own connectivity and we would go to a cloud provider like Amazon or Google, which are the two biggest in the world that do that. There wasn't a requirement to really know how they handled that data specifically as much as there is today. Now that conversation is much more about what visibility and transparency can you give me about how my data is going to flow? Can you give me assurances that data in country X is going to stay in country X and or avoid country Y? Who are the nationals that might be touching this data? So it's a much more complex sort of equation than it used to be. And I think that's part of there's also opportunities around all of this, and I think your point's well taken, that there is a domestic play in some of these providers trying to get into the data center space, and I've heard people say that as well in particular countries. And so there's a lot of different factors that are driving it, but I do think when we're talking about corporations, we're probably saying that just because we're the biggest spenders in making these kinds of decisions, but obviously any individual user will be impacted by the decisions that any of the services that they provide use.
I think it spans both, companies and individuals. If you think of the cloud broadly enough, Gmail is the cloud, Flickr is the cloud, Twitter is the cloud. But I think maybe the more interesting point to bring out here is that another trend that results from this shift to the cloud on the part of large companies is that in the past, surveillance, particularly where it was the result of a government order, would be surveillance orders would be served on the company, on the enterprise. That might be the target of it.
You mean the company meaning the information company?
Right. So no. What I'm saying is that you had several different cases. So if a Gmail user is a target, then you serve an order on Google. But if a corporation is a target, a bank under investigation, for example, in the past you had to serve process on the bank. Now there's a shift occurring, and you can serve it on a cloud provider. So again, these few large cloud providers have become really central, not only for U.S. law enforcement and intelligence, but for foreign law enforcement and intelligence as well, because they see an alternative path to gain access to the data, and that puts the cloud providers right in the target.
Go ahead.
I mean, then they can seek it potentially in a way that the enterprise, the customer of the cloud is not aware that they're seeking it.
Yeah, there's a distorting effect too. Very often, from a technical perspective, cloud storage, cloud computing is more secure and more reliable because, Amazon Google, Microsoft can probably run a data center better than you can. And if you have one, it's in one location, and there's a blackout or an earthquake, whatever, you're in trouble, but these are replicated all over the world, potentially. So you have more availability and maybe more security, except now you have to go temper your purely technical decision by, okay, if it's outside the U.S., the NSA has more legal rights under U.S. law to look at it, And maybe other governments will look at it more because they've got more access to the cables than they would if it were purely domestic. So you've got the surveillance concerns and legal process concerns conflicting with the purely technical judgment about how best to run a secure, highly available service.
So what has that led as a practical matter in terms of internal measures to protect data from government surveillance? We've talked about it a little bit. The code words are privacy by design. I'm not sure I fully understand, but the question is this advancing privacy by design, which I assume just means ways of setting up your systems to protect privacy, but go ahead.
No, I'm sure probably Steve can address this better than I can, but the answer to your question is yes, I think so. I mean, I think we spend a lot of time, as I'm sure anyone who's trying to figure this stuff out, is what are the factors that drive our decision-making? And certainly, if you, by intention, design it into the architecture of how your infrastructure works, and I think there's going to be a panel this afternoon that may touch on this as well. That is a much more thoughtful discussion now that has more factors that we're needing to look at. And how do we manage the governance around the data that we're concerned about is certainly a part of that as well.
Yeah, privacy by design is exactly what it sounds like. You design your system so that you don't have certain data, or it's stored in a form that's useful to you but not useful to somebody who steals it, say for identity theft. It's a complicated question. There's no one formula, but it's what it sounds like. You design it to be inherently more secure. Something that doesn't exist can't be stolen.
It doesn't exist, right?
If it doesn't exist, it cannot be stolen.
There's another interesting tension here that this question brings up. Going back to Steve's opening comment, it always matters who the adversary is. And I think by talking about privacy by design, you're thinking of outsiders as the adversary. Somebody who would hack into a system or attack the system. And that could even be the government to some extent if they're behaving in ways that, try to undermine weaknesses in security. But if we think about this in terms of how companies have responded to the Snowden revelations, and particularly these cloud service providers, you can see what they're doing under two headings, which in a paper I wrote I called old wine in new bottles and new wine in new bottles. So the old wine is just fixing pre-existing security vulnerabilities. So a lot of what companies are doing now is they're implementing particularly encryption protocols that have been around for decades, but that they just didn't see the benefit of implementing in the past, either because it was costly or it undermined ease of use or a variety of reasons that were largely economic. So in the wake of the Snowden revelations, a lot of companies are very prominently announcing that they're going to take the behalf of their customers and implement strong encryption across their services, et cetera. That's sort of a first step, and it doesn't really it may interfere with some ways in which the government tries to break into a system, but it doesn't interfere at all with orders that the FBI or other parts of the government can serve on a company. The much more radical step, which is only just beginning to be discussed, would be for companies to implement security protocols that keep the company itself from gaining access to the data. Then when the government comes knocking on the door and says, hand over the encryption keys, the companies would say, we can't. The end user has the encryption key. And the end user has the encryption key, and we're blind to this data. Now, paradoxically, that may not really be that likely to occur, because another trend here, and this is an additional tension, is that a lot of companies themselves want access to data because that's their business model.
Which was the earlier conversation.
Yeah, so they may not be willing to blind themselves to the data, but if they took a more radical approach of implementing a kind of decentralized approach to security and encryption, then you'd have, I think, a really kind of a new issue of first impression for the government to deal with, which is what do they do, and there have been just a few cases like this, but what do they do when a company cannot cooperate? The technology doesn't allow them to cooperate. And that would
Strikes me
radically
that-
change things.
That the possibility of that completely depends on what the company's doing. I mean, a bank cannot not have access to its data. But some other kinds of companies that are basically communication networks that perhaps could. So it just depends on what kind of company you're talking.
And I think it goes back to your design question, which is when you're thinking about a service or a product, you're trying to also think about what activity might actually attract regulation and scrutiny. And so you might design a platform in such a way that you are providing the technology to connect people, but you're not actually the one connecting people, so that you could avoid being the part that attracts that regulation and that scrutiny. And I think an example of that is following up on your example of going to the banking situation. If you look at banks need to keep a track of the messaging that's going back and forth between traders, because they need to be able to show US regulators or UK regulators or whoever, this is what the transaction is, the audit trail for that. So if you're a company looking at that, you might say, well, we could be in the business of connecting two individual traders who are doing a transaction. Or you might say to yourself, but the better play would actually be to be the person who's providing the technology software to allow people to do that and then let them do it, so that we're not in the business of receiving subpoenas all the time on securities investigations. And so I think that is, and I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, Ira, but I do think that's a permutation of it, which is people who are looking at business models for new companies or people who are in existing businesses might make decisions to avoid being in the crosshairs of particular kinds of activities.
The end-to-end encryption, as I was just describing, in other words, one device to another, they have the keys, and anyone in the middle cannot decrypt what is communicated. That is sort of the paradigmatic privacy by design feature, and it has not been the subject of a whole lot of cases, but it is a very active discussion that is going on right now. And I think, as I think Ed pointed out at the beginning, a lot of this really does flow from the Snowden disclosures and from the desire of companies, and again, now I'm speaking mostly about internet companies, to show all of the ways that they are not doing the things that were attributed to them in the wake of the Snowden disclosures. I had the unenviable position of responding to the Snowden fallout both in the government and then outside the government more recently. And I think if you look back at when these things first started happening, the companies would come to the government, and I was there, so I can't criticize, and they would say, we are getting killed. Our customers believe that we are working with you on an hourly basis and just turning over all our information. Please help us tell the world that's not happening. And the government would, not respond and would, I think, and took the view that this will blow over. It's not really going to be that serious. And the result was that companies have felt the need to move further and further away from the government. And I think a lot of what you're seeing now is a result of that trend.
I gather that there has been differential policies among the large data information service companies as to overt cooperation with the government. Is that right? And there are at least two of you were in the government at some relevant time. Because we had the recent Second Circuit opinion about the Section 215, which is about mandatory disclosures, but there were also, but even there, I mean, some companies were raising problems and others were just handing things over. And the question is, has that changed? Has this whole atmosphere changed the reactions? And what kinds of considerations sort of govern how the companies react to their role with the government?
I mean, from my perspective, I think there was a range of willingness to cooperate. I think now the range is between unwilling to cooperate and extremely unwilling to cooperate. I mean, I think companies are understandably wary of being too closely associated with the kinds of activities that make the public uncomfortable. To get back to some comments that Mike Morrell has made, there were really 3 breaches of trust, I think, that came out of the Snowden disclosures. A breach of trust between the government and its citizens, that's one. A breach of trust between the government, our government, and other governments, that's another. And then the final one, a breach of trust between the government, a breach of trust between the people who use the communication technologies that the government was purportedly surveilling and those companies. And in some ways, that's the hardest one to resolve. So I think companies have to take that into account when deciding what their public posture is going to be. And they're all patriotic citizens. They all want to keep the country safe as much as anyone else does, but they also have to respond to customer demand.
And I think you also have to be mindful, if you're an international company, that whatever position you take relative to one government will be possibly used as leverage against you by another government. And so it's easier to say, we do not do this. It's a harder answer to say, we do not do this, but sometimes we do.
That, I think, was one of the motives for Apple in beefing up the encryption on the iPhones because, well, according to the New York Times, China is the biggest growth market for iPhones and so on. They're manufactured there, and requests from the Chinese government, could you decrypt this phone? How do you treat that differently than requests from the US government or the French government or the Russian government or the British or what have you? And how do you reconcile this with other values and just the PR aspect of it? It's easier to say, we technically cannot do this. It's a consistent policy, it's a simple policy, and by the way, it happens to block nasty governments as well as, unfortunately, ones we trust.
And just to give some more detail to the programs that U.S. industry responded to, in the Snowden revelations, one program that came to light was called Muscular, and this was a program through which the NSA was intercepting data as it flowed from one company data center to another company data center because the company had not implemented the proper encryption protocol. So in effect, the NSA was breaking in. And then a second program, government program called Bull Run, was a program to basically mount covert attacks on different encryption protocols and to undermine security standards. So I think two thoughts. One is that there's kind of a fourth breach, if you will, between this activity and the underlying values of the internet, which depend on the cooperative development of protocols where everybody using the internet behaves well vis-a-vis those protocols. Otherwise, since nobody owns or controls the internet, it'll just not work properly if that principle is not observed. And then the second thought is to just emphasize how much of a sense of outrage and anger there was on the part of companies when these two things came to light. And I'll quote, to me, an extraordinary statement from, as it happens, Brad Smith, the general counsel of Microsoft, my former boss, who put out a blog about almost a year and a half ago in which he said, government snooping potentially now constitutes an advanced persistent threat alongside sophisticated malware and cyber attacks. An advanced persistent threat is kind of a term of art that Steve can describe in more detail, but it means like just a really serious form of attack from a very sophisticated and well-resourced adversary.
In this country, it's usually been a code word for China or Russia. But,
so for the general counsel of Microsoft, who is not a man given to radical statements or empty rhetoric, to call this an advanced persistent threat and compare it to malware and cyber attacks is essentially to say that a leading US multinational has to design its systems in a way that treats the US government in much the same way as it treats any foreign government posing a threat or any hacker.
Well, I mean, I
And
think-
that rhetoric is just extraordinary.
It's caused a sea change in the dialogue because it's very, it was a very sort of binary view that the U.S. was trying to put out there in terms of the good side of the world and the bad side of the world. And I think now, as we do business around the world, people say it's not that simple. And we have now seen evidence that, in fact, the things that people in the U.S. were pointing fingers about are happening in the U.S. as well, right?
But that raises the question that Ed alluded to is, okay, so now companies are, I mean, when Target or Blue Cross had all of their data hacked into, I presume they went to the government and said, find somebody and prosecute them. So if they're going to find somebody and prosecute, they're presumably going to have to know a fair amount about your system.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can speak to that, and I think it gets back to one of your earlier questions, which is, security from what? And when we talk about privacy, I think we've hit a lot of different territories that are significantly different. One is privacy is important to people even if you lose their data by accident, and it happens. I've seen hard drives get lost, unencrypted, FedEx packages fly open, and and hard drives are out in the public. And if that gets exploited, your customers are not going to be happy with you. They're going to say their privacy was violated, and it wasn't due to a deliberate adversary. It was due to the fact you didn't give it enough care. That's kind of one area. Then you have people who are intentionally trying to go after your soft spots and try to exploit things. And that's, I think, a different kind of adversary, and the degree to which encryption can be helpful, the degree to which the government can find out who did this and bring them to justice is going to be very different circumstance by circumstance. Even when you put privacy in by design, there are usually spots that can be exploited, if for no other reason by an insider. I mean, if any of you have ever watched the Oceans movie series, Oceans 11, Oceans 14, it's a good example of looking at an industry that knows that it's handling a lot of cash, a lot of money, that it has physical objects like cards, roulette wheels, dice, and they put very strong security over it. And it looks like it's almost impenetrable until somebody puts their mind to break into it. And they really take a look and say, well, it has to work a certain way. What if we compromise the guy who supplies the dice? Or what if we get in over this way? And it's when you get against security from what? When you're up against a dedicated adversary, whether you believe it's a government or whether you believe it's criminals, they can probably find soft spots even in your privacy by design. Some of the things that you mentioned as examples, end-to-end encryption sounds good until you realize there's a temporary state for just a second or two when it's unencrypted so the system can deal with it. And it sits in memory, not on the hard drive. And somebody figured out software that can actually grab that information in that temporary state and copy it. It's a little bit like the Oceans 11 or the Oceans 14 movie. Somebody studied it and decided how to get it from you. And when that happens, I think it's security from an adversary, and very often they do turn to the government and say, nobody should be allowed to engage in this kind of behavior. Who is it? We want it to be revealed, investigated, and prosecuted. But in both examples, accident or deliberate, privacy is, I think, suffers a challenge and is hurt, but the cause is different, and therefore the way you cope with it is different.
But is the concern about government surveillance leading to any reluctance to invoke government assistance in situations like that? That's my question.
Yeah, and I would say, given that backdrop, I would say yes from experience, and I think some of the other panelists have talked on this, because they don't trust what the government's box will do. And I think this is where you have to be, if the way to get back to trust is to reveal enough about your process and what you were doing so that the entity whose trust you want feels confident that they can grant it. And that's going to be different in different situations. I mean, I've had examples where our firm has had to actually do technical investigations in China with Chinese state entities. And the only way we were able to get their comfort was to show that entity the exact type of computer code we were going to run, line by line so they could review it, deploy it in their network with them watching us, and setting it up so we would never take a thing out of that environment unless they consented to it. That gave them the confidence to say, all right, if that's the way, what you're going to do, and that's the way you're going to do it, we'll consent to it. But the government usually isn't set up to try to win those types of trust discussions. It's almost it comes back to the whole idea, can you elect to engage in this? So I feel there is reluctance, and if the reluctance is there, people are unwilling more now than ever to say, yeah, I'll trust the black box if you tell me this is what it does. You have to open up that black box and show what it does. That's been my experience lately.
Another example, there's a bill that's in Congress right now for information sharing on cybersecurity, and a lot of the privacy groups have denounced this as just another vehicle to do surveillance. Whether or not this data is that's going to be shared is actually sensitive is almost irrelevant. But a lot of people saying, no, we don't want this. We don't really trust what you want this information for. This is especially in the wake of the Snowden revelations. If you're spying on other ways, and now you're saying we have to share information even more beyond the encryption after you decrypt it, no, we're not going to do this. So it is, to whatever extent that this information sharing will help, the public support for this has been seriously hurt by the knowledge of government surveillance.
And that's true even though in the information sharing legislation, there are multiple ways that personally identifiable information is protected, removed, and there are restrictions on what the government can do with information that's shared. But you know, Steve is exactly right. It is viewed as surveillance in another form, which I think, you know, in some ways is very unfortunate because there is a real problem, as you know, government has been trying to say with cybersecurity, and information sharing is a critical part of the solution. And this is a bill that has now been in various forms in front of Congress for about 3 years.
I have one other question, and then we'll open for larger questions, and that is the international regulation part of this. We touched on it a bit, but have the concern about, I gather that the concern about government surveillance here has led to even more restrictions in other countries about privacy and transatlantic data flow mechanisms, and what problems does this present for domestic companies in terms of compliance and finding out even what the rules are? Anybody? Is that an
Well,
question?
I really feel for a compliance officer at a large multinational corporation, because just navigating the various data privacy laws in all of those
But
different
have they
countries.
been affected by all this so that they've become even more restrictive?
Yes, well, the problem isn't just the restrictiveness, it's the lack of uniformity. I think over a period of time, there was sort of convergence of directional movement of legislation around the world towards some common principles. And I think, and I do think it's Snowden, but what I think that event and that time period has done is now we've seen a fracturing of some of that. And so now we're being exposed to particular regimes that are very difficult to comply with because they put specific requirements in place that conflict with larger architectural things that you would want to do for efficiency or effectiveness or latency. And so anyone who's in my kind of situation is trying to balance all of that. And so the answer is yes, it has made it worse. And what's made it worse has been that there has been this fracturing or, you know, I guess, balkanization of regulations around the world. And I think that that's just the model of legislation on an international basis that I think we're going to be seeing moving forward. I don't see that trend going away. I'd be curious to hear in the later panel what our colleagues from the DPAs think about that. But at least that's, from my perspective in the private sector, when I look out, that's what I see.
And other countries are really starting to put new enforcement effort behind some of those laws. I mean, I don't know whether this has happened to you, but some countries, some companies find employees who are being threatened with actually being put in jail over these, over potential breaches of data, over potential breaches of data privacy laws.
There's another complication here, which is that there is this, lack of harmonization among many world data protection laws, but the laws of Europe are particularly influential because of a requirement that international data transfers are restricted unless the receiving country has adequate privacy laws. So in that sense, European law kind of sets that standard for adequacy. And there's a agreement between the US and Europe called the Safe Harbor Agreement, which is now under attack and in peril due to the Snowden revelations, because the Europeans see that as just a easy way for the US government to gain access to the data of European citizens under surveillance laws that are too, too broad and too wide. So you have this additional pressure occurring on the underlying legal means for international data flows, but at the same time, the privacy officials in Europe are not really responsible for national security. So they're speaking to these national security issues, but that's not really within their ambit. And there's maybe a different kind of negotiation and conversation going on among domestic national security agencies, country to country, but these two, sets of negotiations haven't really come together yet.
And certain assumptions that people have taken for a long time, that EU standards are going to be this sort of standard bar that we all look to, are now also potentially under threat because of the recent elections in the UK. The Conservatives came to power, they're ruling without a coalition. There's questions about whether or not there will be a referendum on the UK withdrawing from the EU, and what does that mean? And there's, the geopolitical landscape is quite interesting for people who are in this field.
Okay, so I think we can open it up to questions. We have about 25 minutes. Yes.
Thanks. So there's already some degree of cyber threat information sharing through the sectoral ISACs and things. So is the sole purpose of the federal legislation to provide some sort of immunity? And if so, immunity from what?
Well, I think the purpose of it is to encourage the private sector to share information with the government about, malware signatures that it's seeing. The sort of catchphrase is a real-time immune system, so that, a threat that pops up in one place is immediately, if it pops up at Pepsi, Coke will know as well. The way I think that the law provides an incentive to share that information, or at least removes disincentives to sharing the information, is to provide immunity for a company from suit based on its sharing of that information with the government.
What sort of suit?
Well, it could be a suit by someone whose information was shared. It could be, potentially an antitrust issue. But I think primarily it's civil lawsuits by people who might have a complaint about information being shared that they somehow have a stake in. And I think that is one disincentive to companies to sharing the information.
It's mostly about PII then?
About PII, yes.
Joel?
So I want to come back. Ed, in the Kickstarter, talked about the need in this environment to have greater trust between companies and the government. That to be successful in dealing with some of the cyber threats, that's going to be essential. But at the same time, we heard, I thought, David, I like the way you put it, the willingness to work with government goes from unwilling to extreme unwilling. We're hearing pushback on the information sharing, the loss of momentum. I think that Thomas, you were reflecting on building bridges between other among legal systems. Sounds like a very bleak picture. I'd like to ask if you can think of two concrete steps that should be taken to begin to improve the relationship between government and the business community so that some of these difficulties will be more effectively addressed going forward? So what would be 2 concrete steps that can be taken to improve that trust between government and companies to work more successfully together?
I'll offer one, and then would love to hear a second. Hopefully there is one. I think that recognizing that it's difficult for the government to say what it's not doing, I think if the government were better able to come out publicly, and if things that happened and things that were attributed to it as a result of the Snowden disclosures are just not true, to come out and say that. And I think there is a real opportunity for the government to do a better job of publicizing and getting credit for some of the things that it has done in the wake of the Snowden disclosures to try to address that trust gap. There have been a number of measures that the government has taken and things that it's announced, but they tend to be put out on Friday afternoon, and they haven't been packaged in a way that I think will create the impression, the true impression in a lot of cases, that the government actually has taken this seriously and has taken steps to ensure that information is safe.
Along a very similar vein, I don't know how many of you have seen Jack Goldsmith's speech transcript of a speech he gave the other day. He posted to the Lawfare blog, but he was calling for a lot more transparency on some of these things by the intelligence community, including especially legal opinions and justifications. The notion of a classified legal opinion, legal reasoning, is a little odd, even to him, and he'd been in that position. Yes, we are doing this, but we're not doing that, and here's why, and here's the rationale. I get a little amused when I see international outrage about certain kinds of government spying when, as best I can tell, from other countries' intelligence agencies, just jealousy. Oh, we do that too, but we don't have the opportunity or the funding. It's a little bit of, in fact, it's not a lot of hypocrisy on that. But trying to understand what is and is not permissible and what is and is not. Some of this actually has been known but never got the public attention. Take reports of NSA hacking into Chinese routers and so on to spy on their network. Well, anyone who's been following the public debate about international negotiations of what is or is not acceptable, it's long known the U.S. has never ruled out, quote, cyber exploitation, national spying, as opposed to attacks or thefts of commercial data. Now it's suddenly a big deal. Why is it bad when China does it when the U.S. has been doing it? Whether or not it's the same thing, just focus the attention. It's long been known and all but publicly admitted. But the unwillingness of Washington to disclose, even in general terms, what its policy aims are has really, really hurt. And I would contrast that with nuclear strategy, which has been discussed and debated publicly for decades.
Yeah, and Joe, just to build on your question, I agree with those comments. I would say maybe what we could do concretely is dial it back one level. What I mean by that is instead of focusing on the federal government standards and national security, do start with the state and local level in this regard. The district attorney, for example, in New York has said that if you look at the number of cases that office receives every month and say how many of them actually involve a handheld device of some type where there's evidence inside it, it's in excess of 90%. And so if we just deal with it at the local level and say, what is the concrete impact? No national security debate, just talking about how do you go about getting to the facts and the truth of a matter. They've said if we cannot deal with these things, then 90% of our cases will be held back in that regard. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily take their position or come out in one way, but I think it's a concrete way to begin to see impact. And I think when we measure risks in society, we don't always talk about, we talk about likelihood, we talk about threat intention, we don't always talk about impact to victim. And I think this is a way to sort of show impact to victims so that people can understand better what's at stake, because they all have a phone, they all have privacy, we all value it. Look at it maybe at a local level where national security encumbered, discussions won't take place, they're more open, and use that as a starting point to say, no, we can get to the national level, but the same concepts that are invoked at the DA level and at the Attorney General's level don't go away when you get into the national security side. They become, the impact can be even greater. And I think that would be a helpful
The
dialogue.
difference, as I understand it, which was somewhat exemplified by the Second Circuit opinion the other day, is that in the local cases, the local police are investigating somebody or something. And the problem in both the over 215 collections and the sort of backdoor ones that Snowden was talking about is that they're not investigating, they're collecting metadata and then they're sorting through it. That's a huge difference.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm not sure the local level really has a whole lot to do with what the concern is in this regard.
Yeah, I think that distinction is enormous, but a lot of times people aren't even aware of, what government can and cannot do, how does encryption affect things, and how does an investigation proceed. When you get to the other level, when it gets to the federal level, I think that is where the more pressing and powerful discussions are, but it could be a practical way to sort of kick off an understanding that is fact-based with investigative dialogue in the mix.
I think there's another point that builds a little bit on Steve's, which is the Fourth Amendment offers protections to U.S. citizens that are not available to foreign persons. And a lot of the concern and scrutiny, particularly from Europe, has to do with the weaker protection available to European citizens vis-a-vis U.S. surveillance. And in a report that was sponsored by President Obama and that came out about a year ago, there were a number of recommendations made for modifying U.S. laws and policies and practices to bring those protections a little bit closer into alignment. So one point is that the government hasn't really carried through yet on that. They haven't really taken steps to put some of those recommendations in place, and I think it would be helpful if they did. A second, and this is where it ties to Steve's point, is that I think it would matter a great deal to U.S. industry and enhance trust if they perceived that the government was taking a really hard look at what would be lost from a surveillance or a national security standpoint if they brought these levels of protection even closer together. So right now, the U.S. government is taking the view that, we're just not going to treat foreign citizens in the same way as U.S. citizens. But it's not clear that they've done a thorough risk analysis of how much would be given up if they caved in on a few of these issues and decided that they would treat foreign citizens and U.S. citizens more similarly, and that would really address one of the major concerns that have been voiced, at least by foreign governments in Europe. So again, it's not so much transparency as just the notion that the U.S. government is recognizing that the situation has changed, and something that may be beyond their comfort zone is something they may still have to consider, or at least take a really hard look at, rather than just take the view, we might have to give something up if we agree to that policy.
And some confidence, I think, would also help that in making these decisions that the government is taking into account factors other than national security and law enforcement, that they're actually also factoring in what effect this will have on trust if, or as I think is increasingly the case, when information is disclosed. Because
isn't that kind of built into the situation now in the sense that the assumption that no one was going to find out what they were doing has disappeared. So therefore, the assumption has to be that people are going to find out what they're doing.
Actually, that was one of Goldsmith's points. He said that, yeah, they've always thought about this, but they never really believed it. They need to think about this a lot more and take it the possibility a lot more seriously now than they have in the past. That's very specifically one of his arguments.
Another question? Yes, back there.
Thanks. I'm Steve McCoskey. I'm from Microsoft, and I wanted to focus back on a point. I think it was Ira made it. I'll describe it as this, that in the enterprise space, one of the concerns is that the enterprise cloud service providers effectively become a giant funnel. And instead of governments going to the customer and saying, you know, we'd like to get the following data from you, they're coming to the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons and the others. And I guess my question, first I'm going to ask a provocative question. Why are we still talking about this? And I'll give you a couple facts that I just think it strikes me as very much the discussion around whether air travel or car travel, is airline travel safer than cars, and why do people still insist, if given the choice, they want to get in a car because they think it's safer. So we have gotten, one of the great things that's come out of the work that a number of companies have done is the ability to actually create and publish these transparency reports. And we do that one side of the company, consumer, one side enterprise. Throw the consumer side away for a second. On the enterprise side, our very first transparency report, which was for the period pre-Snowden, right, when you would assume that things were the worst, we were able to say we did not turn over any enterprise, and that includes business and government, customer data pursuant to, for national security reasons, right, from any government. And then secondly, for just, what I'll call normal level law enforcement requests, we received a total of 4 requests, three of which our practice is to redirect to the actual customer. In those 3 cases, the governments said, that's fine, we'll go to the customer. And the customer then came back and said, this is fine, disclose this. If this were in our possession, we would disclose it. You guys go ahead and disclose it. And the 4th one was actually a customer coming to us and saying, we've gotten this request from a government and we don't have this data, so we need you to come up with it. And so my point, and we've done transparency reports every year, and the enterprise ones look surprisingly similar to this. I mean, what I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear this back, is this a failure of marketing, or is this still the sort of fear of the unknown? Namely, well, maybe they're just telling me what they're allowed to tell me, and they have gag orders on other ones where there's, far more invasive and more numerous disclosures without the enterprise or business or government customer knowing. I mean, any thoughts on why that's just failed to sort of become part of the set of facts that people use to rationally discuss these cloud issues?
Can I ask you a question, actually? Has the government imposed any restrictions for enterprise transparency reports on disclosing precise numbers, or are you allowed to?
There are a lot of requirements, and so, but they don't impact the numbers I gave you, right? So and I'll add one more caveat, which is we feel so strongly about this redirection process that, we've even taken the FBI to court over it. And in a Seattle case, we were successful in getting them to allow us to, basically to redirect. They said there was a gag order on the initial order, and we said, that's not the way we would like to do business here. So I don't think the numbers that I gave you reflect any of these different caps. If we talked over on the consumer side, it'd be a much fuzzier story because of these different buckets and caps, but not in the enterprise space. Those are the numbers, plain and simple.
I think one of the issues is simply what we've been saying all along. It's lack of trust. People do not believe what they're hearing from the government, do not believe they're hearing the whole story, do not believe that corporations are allowed to tell the truth. Whether or not they even trust the corporation is a separate matter, but people don't believe it. I'll give one example on the so-called Section 215 program, collecting all these phone company call detail records. And a lot of privacy advocates have focused on descriptions of what was done with the information because they all included the phrase, under this program. What does that mean? Is there some other program where you're doing more things with it? Whether or not this is just an accent of wording that people have focused on, the fact is undeniable that people have focused on it, and there's never been a blanket denial. No, it's just wording. So people just don't believe with either what they're hearing or what they're not hearing. And that's a concern.
I think if you asked most people just off the street what the U.S. government is doing, I think a lot of them would say the U.S. government is collecting the content of every phone call in the United States and listening to it. And so the perceptions of what the government both is actually doing and is capable of doing are so out of whack with what it is actually, in fact, surveilling. I think the difference there is so large that it creates these misimpressions that, well, there must be serving thousands of orders on cloud providers for their customers' information. And I would think that for a company that provides these cloud services, it's got to be a decision of whether you really want to go out there and publicize this issue, or whether it's better to not focus on it. So, I mean, I sympathize. I think it is a hard message to get across, but I think Steve is right. A lot of it is just that if people hear that there are 0 orders, they assume that they're being accounted for in some other way.
Anyone else? Any more questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm TJ McIntyre from Digital Rights Ireland and University College Dublin, and perhaps I can give you something of an outsider perspective here. The comment that people are, for example, worried about the US government recording every phone call in the United States are somewhat misplaced. But of course, we know that every phone call in the Bahamas, literally every phone call in the Bahamas, was being recorded for a period of time. We know that that was also the case in a Middle Eastern country, which I believe is Afghanistan, but I don't think that's ever actually been confirmed. And I think that goes to a wider problem here, perhaps, which reflects the framing of the debate. To the extent that this is presented as a concern about information being disclosed by individual companies, and that can be safeguarded against by transparency reports and so on, I think doesn't really reflect public concern, which is that there is a much wider dragnet of surveillance taking place from individual companies, under the Section 215 program, for example, but also from tapping of the backbone at various points, from the various CNE techniques that are taking place at various exchanges throughout Europe and elsewhere. And I wonder whether the panel has any perspective on whether reforms at the accessing of information from individual companies will actually be effective in allaying public concern to the extent that that wider dragnet surveillance continues to take place. In other words, are we actually looking at the wrong place here? Even if, and following the safe harbour decision in Europe, there will necessarily be some reform imposed in this direction. But even if that takes place, is that still going to allay public concern?
Thomas?
You know, I mean, it's a hard question to answer. It is true that that 12333 executive order allows a lot of collection outside the United States, that the programs that have been the focus of the Snowden, of the discussions about the Snowden revelations don't. I mean, my sense is that at least within the United States, and I think this may be an area where the perceptions are different domestically and abroad, that the perception is that 215 and to a lesser extent 702 have been the source of a lot of the government surveillance. But you know, the reforms do not address 12333.
It feels like ultimately that's a question that would have to be resolved politically, on initially on a country-by-country basis and then reflected in diplomacy and maybe, you know, further use of human rights instruments in setting the framework for how governments interact. But I do think it's largely a political issue at the domestic level, because unless citizens, you know, rise up and object to that kind of dragnet capability and reform their own laws, I don't think it'll change. And that seems to be largely a function of what's happening politically within the country. We see France now entertaining, you know, a much broader surveillance bill in response to recent events there. So I guess I just see it in political terms.
We are about at the end, so, and there are no more questions, so thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. We'll now adjourn for lunch.